Every morning the old man showed up at the west gate of the base. Faded denim jacket, canvas bag, limping gait. This is how he'd existed for 4 years, another invisible janitor among hundreds at Raven Rock Air Force Base. That day changed when a 3-star Army general froze in his tracks, turned the color of a ghost, and breathed out a name that had lain undisturbed for the last 42 years. Before we get into this particular story, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. You're going to want to know what happens at the end of this one. Thomas Reed was 74, and he much preferred it when people weren't aware of his presence, not because of a bashful nature, but because of necessity. Long before, Thomas had discovered that it was far more comforting to remain invisible than visible. Far more comforting, and a lot less complicated when it came to questions regarding scars that went beyond his flesh. Every morning, he arrived at Raven Rock Air Force Base at 5:30 sharp. The guard at the west gate, a young airman named Liam Carter, would hand him a temporary badge without much conversation. Thomas would nod once, shuffle through the checkpoint, and disappear into the administrative building where he spent 3 hours cleaning floors that most people never looked at twice. It was honest work, simple work, the kind that kept your hands busy and your mind quiet. And for Thomas Reed, quiet was exactly what he needed. But on this particular Tuesday morning in late November, as the New Mexico desert began its slow transition from black to gold, something was different. Carter wasn't just handing over the badge. He was watching, really watching. The way Thomas had once watched enemy positions through rifle scopes, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, threats. "Morning, Mr. Reed," Carter said. Thomas nodded. "Same as always." "You prior service?" Carter asked. Thomas paused. His hand, weathered and spotted with age, hovered over the badge. For a moment he considered lying, but lies required maintenance, and he was too old for that kind of work. "Long time ago," Thomas said. His voice was rough, like gravel shifting. "What branch?" "Army." "What did you do?" Thomas picked up the badge and met Carter's eyes. For just a second, the young airman saw something that made him straighten involuntarily, something that didn't belong in the face of an old janitor. "My job," Thomas said quietly. Then he walked through the gate before more questions could follow. Inside the administrative building, the motion sensor lights flickered on as Thomas pushed his cleaning cart down the east corridor. The wheels squeaked, one of them perpetually off-kilter, like his right leg. He'd been meaning to fix both. Never got around to either. The building was empty this early. Just him and the photographs on the walls. Decades of Air Force history frozen in frames. Young faces in dress blues, standing at attention, ready to do whatever their country asked. Thomas tried not to look at them. Recognition was dangerous. Memory was a minefield he'd spent 40 years avoiding. But this morning, something caught his eye. A new photograph, recent, judging by the digital clarity, a ceremony from last week. Officers in full dress, ribbons gleaming under parade ground lights. And in the center, shaking hands with the base commander, was a face Thomas recognized. General Frank Holloway. 3 stars on his shoulder boards, silver at the temples, but the same squared jaw, the same intense focus in his eyes. The caption read, "General Holloway commends Raven Rock's contributions to national security." Thomas stopped. His hands, already old and unsteady, tightened on the mop handle until his knuckles went white. The hallway seemed to tilt, and suddenly he wasn't in New Mexico anymore. He was in Vietnam. 1968, Quang Tri Province. Jungle so thick you could barely see 10 feet in any direction. And a young lieutenant named Frank Holloway, 24 years old, lying in the mud with blood running from his nose and ears. Thomas closed his eyes and forced himself back to the present. The building was still empty. The lights still hummed. The past was still the past. no matter how hard it tried to become the present. He continued his route, methodical and precise, but the photograph had done its damage. Memory, once triggered, didn't stop just because you asked it to. At 6:30, Thomas finished his shift. He returned the card to storage, hung his access badge on its hook, and walked back toward the west gate. The sun was fully up now, turning the desert gold and merciless. Carter was still at the checkpoint. His shift ended at 8, but he was waiting. Thomas could tell by the way the young airman stood, deliberate, positioned. "Mr. Reed," Carter said as Thomas approached, "can I ask you something?" Thomas didn't stop walking. "Badge is on the hook, cart's put away, bathrooms are clean, nothing to ask about. It's not about your work." Carter stepped out from the checkpoint booth. "I pulled your file yesterday. Well, tried to. Most of it's restricted above my clearance level." Thomas stopped now. Slowly, he turned to face the young airman. "Restricted files usually mean one of two things," Carter continued. "Either you did something bad or you did something so good they don't want people knowing about it. And you don't strike me as the bad type." "You don't know me, Airman." "No, sir, but I know that walk." Carter gestured at Thomas's limp. "That's not arthritis, that's shrapnel. And I know that look you get when you think nobody's watching. That's the look of someone who's seen things they can't unsee." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere in the distance, a jet took off from the runway, engines screaming against gravity. "What do you want?" Thomas asked finally. "Truth? I want to know why a man with a restricted service file is cleaning floors at dawn instead of—" Carter trailed off, searching for words. "Instead of being recognized for whatever it was you did. Maybe I like cleaning floors. Do you?" Thomas looked at the desert, at the base beyond the gate, at the life he'd built from silence and solitude. "It's honest work. Doesn't require explaining anything to anyone. That's worth something." "General Holloway's coming next week," Carter said. "Change of command ceremony. He's giving remarks, touring facilities. He might walk right past you." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's got nothing to do with me." "Doesn't it?" Carter held his gaze. "Because the way you looked at that photo yesterday, the one they just hung up of Holloway, that wasn't nothing. That was recognition. That was history." "Airman Carter," Thomas said, and his voice carried the edge of old authority. "Let me make something very clear. Whatever you think you know, you don't. Whatever connection you think exists between me and that general, it doesn't. I clean floors. He runs operations. That's where the similarity ends. Are we clear?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Clear, sir?" Thomas walked past him toward the parking lot. His truck, a 1987 Ford that had seen better decades, sat waiting in the employee section. He climbed in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. But his hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and the past, which he'd kept carefully locked away for 42 years, was rattling at the door. Thomas's apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a man who didn't want to be found. Third floor of a building where the air conditioning hadn't worked since 2012. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchenette with appliances older than Carter. Furniture that came with the place and looked like it had never left. He sat in the single chair by the window, still wearing his jacket despite the heat. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly. Not from age, though age was part of it. From memory forcing its way through walls he'd spent decades building. Frank Holloway, 3 stars, still alive, still serving, still carrying that intensity that had made him a good lieutenant and, apparently, a better general. Thomas closed his eyes. Vietnam, 1968. The jungle was a living thing that wanted to kill you. Lieutenant Frank Holloway was 24 years old and in command of a platoon that had seen too much action in too short a time. 32 men when they deployed. 19 left after 3 months of operations along the DMZ. Staff Sergeant Thomas Reed was 32 ancient by combat standards, and had somehow survived 2 tours when most men didn't finish one. He didn't talk much, didn't need to. His eyes said everything. Stay alert, stay low, stay alive. The operation was supposed to be routine. Patrol the sector, check for NVA movement, return to firebase before dark. But routine was a lie in Vietnam. Routine was what got you killed. They were 3 clicks from the landing zone when the ambush opened up. Contact front. Automatic weapons fire from an L-shaped ambush that caught them in a perfect kill zone. The jungle exploded with gunfire and screaming. Holloway went down immediately, not hit, but knocked off his feet by an RPG that detonated close enough to blow his eardrums and scramble his brain. Reed moved without thinking. That was the thing about combat. Thinking got you killed. You trained until action became reflex, until your body moved before your mind caught up. He grabbed Holloway by his vest handle and dragged him toward cover, firing his M16 one-handed while pulling 180 pounds through mud and blood. The platoon returned fire, but they were pinned. 3 men down in the first 30 seconds. 5 more hit before the first minute ended. And the enemy fire just kept coming, disciplined and deadly. Reed got Holloway behind a fallen tree and assessed the situation in seconds. They were outnumbered, outgunned, about to be overrun. The radio operator was dead. The medic was hit. The remaining men were scattered across 50 meters of jungle, fighting but losing. "Lieutenant!" Reed shook Holloway hard enough to rattle teeth. "I need you functional." Holloway's eyes focused slowly. Blood ran from his nose and ears. Concussion, probably severe. But his hands still worked and his weapon was operational. "We're dying here, sir," Reed said flatly. "I need you to call in everything we've got. I'm going to flank them." "You can't," Holloway slurred. "They'll cut you apart. They're going to kill everyone if I don't." Reed checked his ammunition. 3 magazines left. Never enough. "You get air support inbound. I'll buy you time." Before Holloway could argue, Reed was moving. Thomas opened his eyes. The apartment came back into focus. Desert heat instead of jungle humidity. Silence instead of gunfire. 74 years old instead of 32. What happened next in that jungle was classified for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics, and everything to do with what one man could do when necessity met skill. Reed didn't remember all of it. Combat compressed time, turned it into fragments of absolute clarity surrounded by fog. He remembered firing, controlled bursts, moving positions after every shot, never staying still long enough to be targeted. He remembered grenades, 3 of them, placed with surgical precision. He remembered hand-to-hand when his ammunition ran out, remembered his knife and what had to be done with it, and he remembered the enemy breaking. Not because they were defeated, but because one man had created enough chaos in their rear to make them uncertain. And uncertainty in combat is death. When the gunships arrived and the jungle erupted in minigun fire and rockets, Reed was lying in the mud 50 meters behind what had been the enemy position. He'd been hit at least twice. His right leg wasn't working properly, and there was blood in places blood shouldn't be. But the platoon was extracting. The survivors were making it to the landing zone, and Lieutenant Holloway, concussed and traumatized but alive, was coordinating their evacuation. Thomas stood slowly from the chair. His joints protested. Everything protested. He moved to the small table where he kept the few possessions that mattered, a shoebox, battered and held together with tape. Inside were the things he hadn't been able to throw away despite trying multiple times. His discharge papers. A few photographs of men who were dead now, letters from people he'd lost contact with. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth that had once been part of a uniform, the medals he'd been awarded and never worn after the ceremonies ended. Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with cluster, Others whose names he'd forgotten because ribbons meant nothing compared to what they represented. Dead friends, failed responsibilities, moments when luck was the only thing between life and body bags. He looked at them for a long moment, then carefully rewrapped them and put them back in the box. Holloway was coming to Raven Rock. And Thomas Reed, whether he wanted to or not, was going to have to decide what that meant. For 3 days, Thomas debated with himself. Go to work and risk running into Holloway, or stay away and lose the only routine that kept him functional. On the 4th day, the day before Holloway's scheduled visit, Thomas made a decision. He'd go to work, do his job. If Holloway happened to be there, fine. If not, fine. What happened in Vietnam was 42 years ago. They were different people now. Recognition wasn't inevitable. But at 5:25 on Tuesday morning, as Thomas sat in his truck in the employee parking lot, staring at the west gate, he knew he was lying to himself. Recognition was inevitable. Men like Holloway didn't forget. Combat created bonds that time couldn't break and distance couldn't stretch. If Holloway saw him, really saw him, the past would become the present whether Thomas wanted it to or not. He could leave, drive away, call in sick, disappear the way he'd been disappearing for 4 decades. But something Carter had said kept echoing. Why is a man with a restricted service file cleaning floors at dawn instead of being recognized? Thomas had spent 40 years believing the answer was simple, because recognition meant confronting what he'd done, what he'd survived, what others hadn't. Recognition meant dragging up memories that needed to stay buried. But maybe the real answer was different. Maybe he'd been hiding not from recognition, but from the responsibility that came with it. The responsibility to remember, to honor, to carry forward instead of burying behind. At 5:30 exactly, Thomas got out of his truck and walked toward the west gate. Carter was at the checkpoint. When he saw Thomas, something like relief crossed his face. "Mr. Reed," Carter said, "wasn't sure you'd come today." "It's Tuesday," Thomas replied. "I work Tuesdays." Carter handed him the temporary badge. "General Holloway arrives at 0900. Ceremony starts at 10. He's touring the administrative building at 0830. Thomas clipped the badge to his jacket. "Not my concern." "Respectfully, sir, I think it is." Thomas looked at him, really looked at him. Carter was young, mid-20s at most, probably hadn't seen combat, probably didn't know what it meant to carry the weight of survival when others hadn't. But he had instinct, and instinct was worth something. "Why do you care, Airman?" Thomas asked. Carter hesitated, then spoke carefully. "My grandfather was Army, Vietnam. He came home different, according to my dad. Quiet, distant. Spent 30 years working factory jobs and never talked about the war, never went to reunions, never accepted recognition." He paused. "He died 5 years ago, and at his funeral, 7 men showed up, men he'd served with. They told us things he'd done, things he'd never mentioned. Turns out my grandfather saved a lot of lives, and he never let anyone thank him for it. Maybe he didn't want thanks, maybe. But we wanted to give it, and he denied us that chance." Carter's voice was firm now. "Sir, I don't know what you did in Vietnam, don't know what happened between you and General Holloway, but I know that whatever it was, it matters. And I think you owe it to yourself and to him to stop hiding from it." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The desert wind kicked up dust around them. Somewhere on base, reveille was playing. "I saved his life," Thomas said finally. "Saved 18 other men, too. Did things I don't talk about and don't want to remember. And I've spent 42 years trying to be okay with the fact that I survived when 11 better men didn't. You think hiding honors their memory? I think leaving them in the past gives them peace." "Does it?" Carter asked. "Or does it just make you feel less guilty?" The words hit like a punch. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Because Carter was right. The hiding wasn't about honor or peace. It was about guilt, about not deserving to be the one who made it home, about carrying weight that felt impossible to share. General Holloway remembers, Carter continued quietly. According to his service record, he mentions that day in every interview, every speech. Says it changed his life. Says the man who saved him taught him what real leadership looks like. He paused. Don't you think he deserves the chance to say that to your face? Thomas closed his eyes, opened them, made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. If I see him, Thomas said slowly, I see him. If I don't, I don't. Either way, I'm doing my job and going home. Understood? Understood, sir. Thomas walked through the gate toward the administrative building. His leg ached more than usual. Every step felt weighted with history. Inside, he went through his routine. Sweep, mop, empty trash. The work was mechanical, which was good. His mind was elsewhere, running calculations, evaluating scenarios, preparing for contact the way he had done a lifetime ago. At 08:15, he heard voices approaching from the main corridor. Multiple people moving with purpose. Thomas was in the East Wing, near the wall of photographs, near the image of Holloway as a young lieutenant. He could leave, slip into a side office, wait until they passed, avoid the entire situation. But his legs wouldn't move, couldn't move. 42 years of distance collapsed in a second, and he just stood there in the corridor, an old man in a denim jacket, holding a mop like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The voices got closer. Thomas recognized the base commander's tone, Colonel Mitchell, efficient and professional. And then another voice, deeper, older, but still carrying authority. Frank Holloway. They came around the corner. 4 people, Colonel Mitchell, 2 aides, and a man wearing 3 stars on his shoulder boards. General Holloway looked older, obviously. Gray hair, lines around his eyes. But he carried himself the same way he had as a lieutenant. Straight back, intense focus, presence that commanded attention. His eyes passed over Thomas once, dismissing him as facility staff. Then snapped back with sudden, absolute focus. Thomas watched it happen. Watched Holloway's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, shock, recognition. Watched 42 years of distance evaporate in heartbeats. Tom? Holloway's voice was barely above a whisper. Tom Reed? Colonel Mitchell looked between them, confused. The aides stopped moving, uncertain what protocol applied. Thomas straightened slightly. Old habits. When a general addresses you, you stand properly even if you're not in uniform. General, Thomas acknowledged. His voice was steady despite everything. Holloway stepped forward, closing the distance with movements that looked dazed. I thought, we looked for you after the war. Nobody could find you. You just disappeared. Got out in 71. Went home. Kept my head down. For 40 years? Holloway's voice carried something between wonder and pain. Tom, you saved my life. You saved 18 other men that day. And you just vanished? Thomas shrugged, the gesture small and tired. Job was done, sir. Didn't see the point in making a career out of it. The point? Holloway looked like he'd been struck. Tom, do you have any idea what you did? That action earned you the Distinguished Service Cross. You turned around an ambush that should have wiped out the entire platoon. I did what needed doing, Thomas interrupted quietly. Same as anyone else would have. No. Holloway's voice was firm, carrying command authority. Not the same. What you did was extraordinary. He looked at Colonel Mitchell. Colonel, how long has Mr. Reed been employed at this facility? 4 years, sir, Mitchell replied, clearly thrown by the situation unfolding in her corridor. Custodial services, exemplary record. Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Something like pain crossed his face. When he opened them again, they were shining with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. Sir, he said, and Thomas realized the general was addressing him with the term of respect. "I need you to understand something. I've spent 42 years in service, made 3 stars, commanded thousands, influenced policy and operations across multiple theaters. And none of that would have happened if you hadn't pulled me out of that jungle. You would have made it without me, General. You were a good officer." "I was a scared kid," Holloway corrected, "and you were the reason I survived long enough to become anything else." He straightened to full attention and rendered a formal salute to a civilian, to an old man in a denim jacket. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and every person I've had the honor to serve with since 1968, thank you, Staff Sergeant Reed." Thomas stood frozen. He hadn't been saluted in 40 years, hadn't stood at attention, hadn't accepted formal recognition, hadn't allowed anyone to acknowledge what he'd done because acknowledgement meant carrying the weight of all those other faces in that photograph who hadn't made it home. But here was Holloway, carrying 3 stars and 4 decades of service, rendering honors to the man who'd saved his life. Slowly, despite every instinct telling him to deflect and disappear, Thomas returned the salute. His hand moved with muscle memory, crisp and precise, the gesture carrying more weight than any words could. When both men lowered their hands, Holloway did something that broke protocol completely. He stepped forward and embraced Thomas, brief, fierce, the kind of hug that spoke to brotherhood earned in circumstances civilians couldn't understand. "I looked for you," Holloway said quietly. "For years. Wanted to thank you properly, to make sure you were okay, to help if you needed anything." "Wasn't looking to be found," Thomas replied. "Didn't want recognition or help. Just wanted to be left alone." "Why?" The question was genuine, pained. "Tom, you're a hero. You deserve—" "I'm a janitor," Thomas interrupted. "Have been for 4 years and was fine with that. Didn't need anyone making more of it." Holloway stepped back, studying Thomas with intensity. "You really believe that, don't you? That what you did doesn't matter?" "Matters to the families of the men who didn't make it," Thomas said quietly. "Matters to their kids who grew up without fathers. What I did was survive, General. That's all. Some of us did and some of us didn't. And getting a medal for being lucky doesn't make me a hero." The corridor was silent. Colonel Mitchell and the aides stood frozen, witnesses to something that transcended military protocol. Holloway looked at Thomas for a long moment, then made a decision. "Come with me," he said. "Please, there's something I need you to see." "General, That wasn't a request, Sergeant." Holloway's voice carried command authority, tempered with something like desperation. "You've spent 40 years believing you don't matter. I'm about to prove you wrong." General Holloway led Thomas through the administrative building toward the parade ground. Colonel Mitchell and the aides followed in confused silence. Thomas walked with reluctance, each step feeling like a mistake, but unable to refuse the 3-star general who'd been a terrified lieutenant the last time they'd met. The ceremony was in full swing when they emerged from the building. Several hundred personnel stood in formation, dress uniforms gleaming in the morning sun. A reviewing stand had been erected, and the change of command ceremony was moments from beginning. Holloway made directly for the reviewing stand. Every eye in the formation seemed to turn toward them, tracking the strange procession of a general leading a civilian in work clothes across the parade ground. At the reviewing stand, Holloway spoke briefly with the sergeant major, then turned to the assembled formations. His voice, amplified by speakers, carried across the entire area with command authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but something more important than protocol needs to happen here." He gestured to Thomas. "This is Thomas Reed. Some of you may know him as the custodian who works in the administrative building. But 42 years ago, he was Staff Sergeant Reed, 5th Special Forces Group, and he saved my life and the lives of 18 other men during an ambush in Quang Tri Province." A murmur ran through the formation. Heads turned. Expressions shifted from confusion to interest. Sergeant Reed received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day, Holloway continued. And then he disappeared from military service, from recognition, from the acknowledgement he'd earned. For 40 years, he's been invisible, doing honest work, but hiding the extraordinary things he accomplished. Holloway turned to face Thomas directly. Sir, I can't give you back those 40 years, but I can give you this moment, because every person on this parade ground needs to know that heroism doesn't always wear stars and command authority. Sometimes it wears work clothes and pushes a broom and lives quietly among us without demanding recognition. He stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly, but still carrying through the speakers. You told me you're just a janitor, that what you did was just survival. But that's not true. What you did was put yourself between certain death and 19 men who had families waiting for them. You didn't have to. You chose to. And that choice has echoed through 40 years of my career, through every decision I've made, through every person I've led. The sergeant major stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Holloway took it and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a military display case. Inside, mounted on velvet, was a Distinguished Service Cross. How did you... Thomas started. I've been carrying a copy of your citation since 1971, Holloway said quietly. Hoped I'd find you someday. He held up the case. This belonged to Captain Wilson from our unit. Remember him? When he died 3 years ago, his family gave it to me. Said he'd want you to have it. Thomas's hands shook. Captain Wilson, dead now. Another face from that photograph, gone. Sergeant Reed. Holloway's voice was formal now, carrying across the parade ground. On behalf of a grateful nation and 19 men who lived because of your courage, I ask that you accept this recognition, not because you need it, but because we need to give it, because honor delayed is not honor denied, because 40 years later, your actions still matter. You still matter. The entire parade ground fell silent. Hundreds of people watching this old man in work clothes stand before a 3-star general and struggle with recognition he'd spent decades avoiding. Thomas looked at the medal case, at the blue ribbon with white stars, at the cross that represented the second highest military decoration for valor, at something he'd earned in jungle mud and blood that now felt like it belonged to someone else. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. But the speakers carried his words to everyone present. Yes, Holloway said firmly, you do. And even if you can't believe that, everyone here deserves to know what you did. They deserve to know that extraordinary service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, that heroes walk among us, invisible, until someone remembers to look. He extended the case toward Thomas. Please, let us honor you the way you should have been honored 40 years ago. Thomas's hands trembled as he accepted the case. The weight seemed impossible, far heavier than wood and metal should be. It carried decades, carried faces of dead men, carried memories of jungle mud and gunfire, and being young enough to think survival meant victory. But it also carried something else, the weight of acknowledgement, of being seen, of having history recognized instead of buried. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice breaking. But I need to say something. Holloway nodded, stepping back. Thomas looked out at the formation. Hundreds of young faces, all in uniform, all representing service and sacrifice. I didn't do what I did to be a hero, he said finally. Did it because those were my men and that was my job. Didn't matter if I was scared or if the odds were bad. Mattered that they needed someone to do something impossible. So I did it, same as anyone else would have. He paused, searching for words that had been buried for decades. But General Holloway's right about something. It does matter. Not because I'm special, Because every person who serves makes choices like that. Every day, choices to put the mission first, to put others first, to do the hard thing when the easy thing it is right there. And those choices add up. They mean something. Thomas looked at the metal case in his hands. I spent 40 years trying to forget, trying to be invisible. Thought that was what I owed to the men who didn't make it. Thought staying small somehow honored their sacrifice. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe honor means remembering, not forgetting. Maybe it means carrying forward instead of hiding. He raised his eyes to meet Holloway's. Thank you, sir, for not forgetting, for making this mean something after all these years. Holloway came to attention and rendered another salute, and this time, when Thomas returned it, the gesture felt different. Not burden, but acknowledgement. Not shame, but acceptance of something earned in ways that couldn't be explained, but could finally be recognized. The parade ground erupted in applause. Not polite protocol, but genuine, sustained recognition. Hundreds of service members honoring one old man who'd done extraordinary things in a war most of them hadn't been alive to see. Thomas stood there holding the metal case, tears running down weathered cheeks, and let himself be seen for the first time in 40 years. The applause continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it finally faded, Holloway placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended rank and ceremony. There's more, Holloway said quietly, meant only for Thomas. If you'll allow it. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Holloway turned back to the formation. I want to share something that I've never discussed publicly. Something that happened in the days after Sergeant Reed saved our lives. The parade ground fell silent again. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When I woke up in the field hospital, Holloway continued, I had a concussion so severe the doctors weren't sure I'd regained full cognitive function. I couldn't remember my own name for 2 days, but I remembered Sergeant Reed. I remembered him coming through that jungle like nothing could stop him, and I made myself a promise. Holloway's voice grew stronger. I promised that if I lived, if I continued to serve, I would carry forward the lesson he taught me that day. Not about tactics or courage, though he demonstrated both. The lesson was simpler and harder than that. When people depend on you, you show up. You don't calculate odds. You don't measure risk. You just show up and do what needs doing. He looked at Thomas. That's the standard you set, Tom. And it's the standard I've tried to meet every single day for 42 years. Not always successfully, but always with the memory of a sergeant who refused to let us die because it was his job to keep us alive. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He'd spent decades believing that what he'd done was just instinct, just training, just being in the right place at a terrible time. But hearing Holloway describe it, hearing the impact it had on everything that came after, was forcing him to reconsider 40 years of carefully constructed understanding. Sir? Thomas managed to say, his voice carrying across the parade ground through the speakers. I need you to know something too. Holloway nodded, encouraging him to continue. I carried guilt about that day for a long time, Thomas said slowly. Still do, if I'm honest. Because I made it home, and 11 men didn't. And for years, I told myself that hiding from recognition was how I honored them. That staying quiet somehow made their loss mean more. He looked out at the formation of young faces. But I was wrong. Hiding didn't honor them. It just made me feel less guilty about surviving. The real way to honor them is to do what General Holloway did. Carry forward. Keep showing up. Keep doing what needs doing. Make their sacrifice mean something by living a life that justifies being the one who made it home. The words surprised Thomas even as he spoke them. He'd never articulated this before, never put into language what had been slowly shifting in his understanding over the past week. So thank you, General, Thomas continued, for not letting me hide anymore, for making me face what I've been running from, and for showing me that maybe, just maybe, I earned the right to stand here today." Holloway's eyes were wet now. He rendered another salute, and this time when Thomas returned it, there was something different in the gesture. Not just acknowledgement, acceptance, peace. The formation erupted into applause again, and this time Thomas let himself feel it. Let himself stand in the recognition he'd spent 40 years avoiding. Let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe he deserved it after all. The ceremony concluded, but Thomas found himself unable to leave. People wanted to shake his hand. Young soldiers wanted to hear his story. Officers wanted to express their respect. It was overwhelming and exhausting and strangely healing. A young sergeant approached, maybe 25 years old, with the look of someone who'd seen recent combat. "Sir," he said, "I just got back from Afghanistan 3 months ago. Lost 2 men in my squad. Been having trouble processing it." He paused, struggling. How did you live with it?" Thomas looked at him, really looked at him, saw himself at that age, carrying the same weight, asking the same questions nobody could answer. "You don't live with it," Thomas said quietly. "You live through it. And some days, that's all you can do, just get through. But eventually, if you're lucky, you find purpose in carrying their memory forward. You make their sacrifice count by being someone they'd be proud to have served with." The young sergeant nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Thank you, sir." He saluted and walked away, and Thomas wondered if he'd said the right thing, if any words could actually help. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just showing up and being honest about the struggle. A captain approached next, older, maybe 40. "Staff Sergeant Reed," he said formally. "I'm Captain Morgan. My father was in your platoon, Private First Class James Morgan. He didn't make it home." Thomas felt his stomach drop. James Morgan. Young kid from Tennessee, 19 years old, always talking about the girl he was going to marry when he got back. He'd been one of the first hit in the ambush, gone before Thomas could even move toward him. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said, the words inadequate, but all he had. "Don't be," Captain Morgan said. "My mother remarried 2 years after Dad died. My stepfather raised me well, loved me like his own. But I've always wanted to meet you. Mom told me that Dad wrote letters about you, said you were the best NCO in the platoon, that he felt safer knowing you were there." Thomas's eyes burned. He was a good soldier, had a big heart, too big for Vietnam. "Mom still has his letters," Morgan continued. "She'd like to meet you if you're willing. She's 73 now, lives in Nashville. She's carried you in her heart for 42 years, wondering if you made it home, hoping you found peace." Thomas couldn't speak, just nodded. Morgan handed him a card with contact information, saluted, and walked away before Thomas could process what had just happened. The widow of a man he'd failed to save wanted to meet him, wanted to thank him. After 42 years of not knowing, she wanted to tell him it was okay. General Holloway reappeared then, having changed from dress blues into a more casual uniform. "Tom," he said, "I have a few hours before my flight. There's a coffee shop off base. Will you join me? No ceremony, no speeches, just 2 old soldiers talking." Thomas wanted to say no, to retreat back to his apartment and his carefully constructed solitude. But that option was gone now. The door he'd kept closed for 40 years had been kicked open, and there was no closing it again. "Yes, sir," Thomas said. "I'd like that." They sat in a booth at a diner 10 minutes from base, both drinking coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. The lunch rush had ended, and they had the place mostly to themselves. "I really did look for you," Holloway said. "For years. Made calls, filed requests, searched databases. It was like you'd vanished completely." "I worked at it," Thomas admitted. "Changed addresses every few years, kept my head down, didn't stay in contact with anyone from the service." "Why, Tom?" Help me understand. Thomas stared at his coffee, watching steam rise and dissipate. You remember what it was like coming home? Some of it? People either wanted to treat us like heroes or monsters. Nobody wanted to hear the truth, that we were just young and scared and trying to survive. And the ones who did survive, we carried this weight, this guilt, because we made it, and so many didn't. Thomas looked up. I couldn't be a hero, Frank. Couldn't stand at reunions and accept thanks when James Morgan and Danny Patterson and Rodriguez and all the others were gone. Felt like theft, like I was stealing recognition that belonged to them. So you disappeared. So I disappeared, got a job at a factory. Then another job when that ended. Moved around, kept moving. Thought if I stayed invisible, the guilt would fade. He laughed bitterly. It didn't. Just got heavier. Holloway was quiet for a moment. You know what I think? I think the guilt would have been lighter if you'd let other people help carry it. If you'd stayed connected to the men who understood. If you'd let us tell you that what you did mattered. Maybe, but I wasn't ready to hear it. Are you ready now? Thomas considered this. Was he? The ceremony had cracked something open inside him, something he'd kept sealed for decades. It hurt, but it also felt like breathing after being underwater too long. I think I have to be, Thomas said finally, because you're right. Hiding didn't help, didn't honor anyone, just made me a ghost. Holloway reached across the table and gripped Thomas's hand. The gesture was firm, grounding. You're not a ghost anymore, Tom. You're here. You're real. And you matter to a lot of people, whether you want to or not. They talked for another hour. About Vietnam, about the years after, about the men they'd served with and the ones who hadn't made it, about Holloway's career, his family, the burden of command, and the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. And Thomas talked too, about the factory jobs and the loneliness, and the nights when he'd wake up in the jungle again, hearing gunfire that wasn't there, about the 40 years of trying to outrun memory and failing every single time. When they finally stood to leave, Holloway pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is something I should have given you earlier, but the moment wasn't right. Inside is contact information for everyone from our platoon who's still alive. 12 men, Tom. 12 men who remember what you did and want to thank you. Thomas took the envelope with trembling hands. I don't know if I can... You don't have to call them all today, or even this year, but they're there when you're ready. Holloway placed both hands on Thomas's shoulders. You're not alone anymore. You understand that, right? You have a family. We're scattered across the country, but we're your family, and we've been waiting 42 years to welcome you home. Thomas felt tears coming again. He'd cried more in the past 6 hours than in the past 40 years combined. Thank you, Frank, for everything, for not forgetting, for finding me, for making me face this. Thank you for saving my life, Holloway replied simply. For giving me the chance to have a career, a family, a future. For being the kind of soldier I could only aspire to be. He smiled. Now go home and rest. You've earned it. They shook hands one final time, and Thomas watched as Holloway climbed into a waiting car and drove away, leaving Thomas standing in a diner parking lot, holding an envelope full of connections he'd spent 4 decades avoiding, feeling more alive and terrified than he had in years. When the crowd finally dispersed, Thomas sat on a bench near the administrative building, still holding the metal case, trying to process what had just happened. Airman Carter approached, no longer in uniform but civilian clothes. Sir, Carter said quietly, I need to apologize. Thomas looked up. For what? For pushing. For digging into your history without permission. For thinking I knew what you needed better than you did. Carter sat down on the bench. I was wrong to force this. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then shook his head slowly. No, you weren't. I was wrong to hide for 40 years. You just made me realize it earlier than I wanted to. You're not angry? Should be. Probably would have been yesterday, but today, Thomas looked at the metal case. Today I'm just tired, and maybe a little grateful. Carter nodded. General Holloway asked me to give you this. He handed Thomas an envelope. Said he had to catch his flight but wanted you to have it. Thomas opened the envelope with stiff fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter on official stationery. Tom, I can't undo 40 years. Can't give back the recognition you should have received or the support you deserved when you came home. But I can do this. You're not alone. 19 men survived that day because of you. I've stayed in contact with most of them over the years. They're scattered across the country now, living normal lives, raising families, growing old like we all do. And every single one remembers. I've attached their contact information. Call them, write to them. Let them tell you what your actions meant. Let them thank you the way I've tried to thank you today. Tom, please consider this. You spent 40 years believing you didn't matter. But you mattered to 19 families, to 19 wives who got their husbands home, to 53 children who got to know their fathers, to countless people whose lives were touched by men who lived because you were willing to do what needed doing. That legacy is real. It's not abstract. It's not ceremony or recognition. It's actual human lives that exist because you were there. You may still believe you're just a janitor, but to those of us who know better, you're the reason we got to become anything at all. With respect and eternal gratitude, Frank Thomas read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. Attached was a list of names and addresses. Some he remembered, some he didn't. All of them were men who'd been in that jungle 42 years ago. You okay, sir? Carter asked. Don't know yet, Thomas admitted. Ask me in a few days. They sat in silence for a while, watching personnel move across the base. Finally, Thomas stood. Airman Carter, thank you for being stubborn, for not listening when I told you to leave it alone, for thinking an old janitor might be worth the trouble. Carter stood and rendered a crisp salute. Sir, you were never just a janitor, but I'm glad you know that now. Thomas returned the salute, then offered his hand. They shook, bridging 40 years and 2 generations. You're going to make a good NCO someday, Thomas said. You've got the instinct for it. Caring when people don't want to be cared about. Looking beyond the surface. Doing the right thing, even when it violates protocol. Learned from the best, sir. Thomas smiled, a small, tired expression that nonetheless carried genuine warmth. Get back to your duties, Airman. As Carter walked away, Thomas looked at the administrative building one last time. He'd spent 4 years cleaning those floors, moving through those corridors invisible, maintaining the comfortable anonymity of someone who didn't want to be seen. But that was done now. Holloway had seen him. Carter had seen him. An entire base full of service members had seen him. There was no going back to invisible. And maybe that was okay. Maybe 40 years was long enough to hide from recognition you'd earned. Maybe it was time to accept that what he'd done in 1968 still mattered, even if he'd spent decades trying to convince himself otherwise. He walked slowly toward the west gate, carrying the metal case and the letter. At the checkpoint, the airman on duty snapped to attention when he approached. Word had spread. Everyone knew now. The Invisible Janitor was a decorated combat veteran. The quiet old man who cleaned floors had saved 19 lives in a jungle firefight most of them hadn't been alive to remember. Thomas Reed, who'd spent 40 years trying to disappear, had been found. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like coming home. The Mason Mug Cafe in downtown Albuquerque was modest, the kind of place where locals gathered for coffee without pretension. Thomas Reed sat at a corner table, but he wasn't alone anymore. He hadn't been alone for months. Across from him sat Marcus Wilson Jr., 53 years old, carrying his father's name and his father's eyes. To his left was Daniel Patterson Jr., 45, whose father Thomas had pulled from the kill zone before Danny Sr. bled out 3 hours later in the medevac. And beside Daniel was Sarah Rodriguez Miller, 68, whose brother Miguel had been the platoon's medic. "Dad talked about you constantly," Marcus said, repeating words Thomas had heard a dozen times from a dozen people over the past year. "Used to tell my sisters and me about that day, about how you came through the jungle like something impossible, about how you got him out when he was certain he was going to die there." "Your father was a good officer," Thomas replied, the response automatic now, but still genuine. "Steady under fire. Kept the men together when things went sideways." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Miguel wrote home 2 weeks before it happened. He said you were the reason the platoon functioned, that you kept everyone alive long enough for them to learn how to stay alive themselves." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "I wish I could have kept him alive too." "You did everything you could," Sarah said firmly. "Mom never blamed you. None of the families did. We just wished we could tell you that." They talked for 2 hours, trading stories and filling in gaps. When they finally had to leave, each of them embraced Thomas with the fierce grip of people who'd waited too long for connection. After they left, Thomas sat alone for a moment, staring at his phone. The list of contacts had grown over the year. 12 survivors from the platoon, 23 children of men who hadn't made it home, 14 widows who'd carried the burden of loss for 4 decades, and now, finally, had someone who remembered their husbands as more than names on a wall. His apartment wasn't empty anymore either. The walls that had been bare now held photographs, the platoon photo from 1968, reunion pictures from the past year, images of children and grandchildren of men whose names Thomas whispered to himself some nights, like prayers. The shoebox was still there, but the medals weren't hidden anymore. They sat on a shelf in a proper display case, visible. Not because Thomas was proud, pride still felt wrong, but because they represented something larger than his own discomfort. They represented 19 men who'd lived and 11 who hadn't, and all the lives that connected to them. His phone buzzed. A text from Liam Carter, who'd been promoted to senior airman and transferred to a base in Germany. "How'd the meeting go?" Thomas typed slowly with stiff fingers. "Good. Hard, but good. They want me at the reunion next month. You going?" Thomas paused. A year ago, the answer would have been immediate and absolute. No. But now, yes, I'm going. "Proud of you, sir." Thomas smiled. The kid had been right all along. Hiding hadn't honored anyone. Only facing the past, walking into it with eyes open and heart exposed, could do that. Another text came through, this one from Frank Holloway. The general, now retired as a 4-star after one final promotion, had stayed in constant contact. Weekly calls, monthly visits when possible, a friendship that bridged rank and time and trauma. "Remember what I told you? You're not carrying this alone anymore." "I know, still getting used to it." "That's okay. You've got time." Thomas pocketed his phone and stood. He had somewhere to be. The Veterans Affairs Hospital downtown ran a support group for combat veterans, and the counselor had asked if Thomas would be willing to talk to some younger guys struggling with their own demons. Marines and soldiers back from Iraq and Afghanistan, carrying a weight that looked familiar, even if the wars were different. At first, Thomas had declined. What could he possibly say that would help? But then he remembered that young sergeant at the ceremony, the one who'd asked how to live with loss. And Thomas realized that maybe the point wasn't having answers. Maybe the point was just showing up and being honest about the struggle. So he'd agreed. And for the past 3 months, he'd been going every Tuesday evening to sit with men 30 and 40 years younger, sharing stories about jungle firefights while they shared stories about desert ambushes, finding common ground in the universal experience of combat and survival and guilt. "You saved my life," one of them had told him last week. A corporal, 28 years old, who'd been on the verge of something permanent and irreversible. Hearing that, even you struggled with this, that even someone like you felt guilty about surviving. It made me realize I wasn't broken, just human. Thomas had gone home that night and cried, but this time, the tears felt different. Not shame or grief, but something closer to purpose. 40 years late, maybe, but purpose nonetheless. On his way home, Thomas made a detour. The New Mexico Veterans Memorial was a quiet place, granite and bronze and carefully tended grass. He'd been coming here every Sunday for the past 6 months, adding it to a routine that no longer centered on invisibility. He walked to the wall where Vietnam casualties were listed, found the names he was looking for: James Morgan, Daniel Patterson, Miguel Rodriguez, 8 others from that day in Quang Tri Province. 11 men total who'd gone into that jungle and never come home. Thomas stood before the wall, holding his canvas bag, the same one he'd carried to work every morning for 4 years, but now it contained something different. Photographs, letters, copies of the stories their families had shared over the past year. "I'm sorry I hid for so long," Thomas said quietly to the names on the wall. "I'm sorry I thought staying invisible honored you. I was wrong." He paused, feeling the desert wind on his face. "But I'm here now, and I'm going to make sure people remember you. Not just as names on a wall, but as men who had families and dreams and futures, who had brothers who still think about them, who had children who grew up without fathers but still carry their father's courage." He touched each name, a ritual he'd developed, a moment of acknowledgement, a promise to carry forward. "I'm going to the reunion next month," he continued. "Going to stand with the men who made it and tell stories about the men who didn't. Going to make sure your kids know that you weren't just soldiers. You were friends and brothers, and the reason I'm still here." The wind picked up, rustling leaves in nearby trees. Thomas felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, because some wounds don't heal, but acceptance. Recognition that carrying this weight wasn't penance, it was responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, that's what honor actually looked like. He stayed at the memorial for another 30 minutes, standing vigil the way he'd learned to stand watch 40 years ago. Alert, present, refusing to let the past be forgotten or the dead be reduced to statistics. When he finally left, the sun was setting behind the Sandia Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red and purple. Thomas walked slowly to his truck, his leg aching from standing so long, but his chest feeling lighter than it had in decades. Tomorrow, he'd go back to work. He still cleaned floors at Raven Rock Air Force Base, but now everyone knew who he was. Young airmen would stop him in the hallways, asking questions about Vietnam, about combat, about service. Officers would salute him as they passed. The base commander had offered him a position with better hours and better pay, but Thomas had declined. He liked the work, liked the simplicity of it, liked that it was honest and humble and kept him grounded, but now it wasn't hiding, it was choosing, and that made all the difference. His phone buzzed again as he climbed into his truck. This time it was a group text from the platoon survivors, all 12 of them in a chat thread that stayed active despite time zones and busy lives, 1 month until reunion. Who's bringing what for the cookout? Thomas smiled, scrolling through the responses. Burgers, beer, stories, laughter. The kind of gathering he'd avoided for 40 years and now couldn't wait to attend. He typed his response, "I'll bring the coffee," and the memories. We've got a lot to remember. The responses came quickly. Thumbs up emojis, laughing faces, and from Frank Holloway, now living in retirement in Virginia. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, brother. See you there." Brother. Thomas turned the word over in his mind. He'd spent so long believing he'd lost his brothers in that jungle. But maybe that was wrong too. Maybe brothers didn't die just because bodies did. Maybe brotherhood was something that survived everything, time and distance and trauma and 40 years of one man's stubborn determination to hide from it. He started the truck and headed home, carrying history instead of being crushed by it, surrounded by family instead of isolated by choice, living instead of just surviving. For the first time in 40 years, Thomas Reed felt like he'd finally completed the mission. Not the one in Quang Tri province, though that mattered. The harder mission? Coming home. Actually, truly, completely coming home. And it turned out that coming home didn't mean forgetting the war. It meant bringing it with you. Carrying the men who didn't make it. Honoring their memory, not by hiding, but by living fully enough for all of them. By showing up. By staying connected. By being the kind of man they'd be proud to have served alongside. The invisible man was visible now. And he was learning that visibility wasn't burden. It was gift. The gift of connection. The gift of purpose. The gift of being known and seen and valued, not despite his past, but because of it. As Thomas drove through the desert twilight toward his apartment, which was no longer empty, no longer silent, no longer a hiding place but a home, he thought about all the years he'd wasted running, about all the connections he'd denied himself, about all the healing he'd postponed because he believed he didn't deserve it. He couldn't get those years back, but he had today and tomorrow and however many days remained. And he was going to spend them doing what he should have done 40 years ago, honoring the fallen by living well, by staying connected, by showing up for the brothers who made it and carrying forward the memory of the ones who didn't. The janitor had finally learned what the sergeant always knew. Real courage isn't charging into the jungle alone. It's coming home and letting people see you, scars and all, guilt and all, human and imperfect and worthy of love anyway. Thomas Reed had spent 40 years being invisible. Now, finally, he was learning to be seen. And it turned out that being seen, really, truly seen, was the bravest thing he'd ever done. To this day, Thomas Reed continues to meet with the families of the men he saved. The bonds formed in that jungle 42 years ago echo through generations. And while he still struggles with survivor's guilt, he's learning that carrying history forward honors the fallen better than hiding from it ever could. Have you ever experienced something similar? Military or not, have you watched someone finally receive the recognition they deserved? Share your story in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Military and Veterans Archives. We share true military stories every single day. These stories matter. They need to be heard. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.